Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the last day of the International Symposium, the doors that Propaganda Fide has opened since 1622. I'm your host, Lucia Zhang. This three-day symposium is co-organized by the Center for Catholic Studies, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Macau Ritchie Institute. The theme for today is Science and Cultural Exchange. Today, the first section is Missionaries and Scientific Development. Our moderator is Dr. Wong Wing Hong. He is Deputy Program Director of the General Education Foundation Program of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He received his PhD in physics from the same university and studied Christian theology at Lutheran Theology Seminary. His academic interests include history of science and dialogue between science and religion. Dr. Wang, please.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for a very kind introduction. And I would like to thank Dr. Anselm Lam for inviting me to be a moderator. I would take this as a very precious opportunity to learn from the three great scholars. Welcome to section number 7 of the International Symposium. The topic of this session is Missionaries and Scientific Development. I myself know very little about this topic. I have heard that missionaries brought the Western calendar to China around the junction between Ming and Qing dynasties. And since then, the Chinese calendar has become very accurate, and even the solar and lunar eclipses can be predicted in an accurate manner. This is all I know about missionaries and scientific development. I therefore must learn more. And today we are very honored to have Professor Chi Han, Dr. Chicheng MA, and Professor Agustin UDÍAS here sharing with us. Before we get started, let me share some housekeeping notes. Before our panelist speaks, I would introduce him, and then he will speak for 30 minutes. And after the three panelists have spoken, there will be a 20-minute panel discussion and Q&A session. And without much ado, let me introduce the first speaker, Professor Chi Han. Professor Han received his PhD from the Institute for the History of Natural Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, in 1991. He's now professor at the School of History, Zhejiang University. His main research field is East-West cultural exchanges from the 17th to 19th century, especially the history of Christianity in China and the transmission of Western science during the Kangxi and Qianlong reigns. He has published numerous books and papers on these subjects. He was the former vice president of the International Society for the History of East Asian Science, Technology, and Medicine. He was editor-in-chief of the 自然科学研究 meaning studies in the history of natural sciences, and a member of the editorial board for the Archive for History of Exact Sciences, Annals of Science, and Historia Scientiarum. The topic he's going to present today is Joachim Prof, the Kangxi Emperor, the study of the I Ching and the theory of the Chinese origin of Western learning. Let me pass the floor to Professor Han.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wong. And so first I share. So good afternoon and good morning, dear colleagues. So first of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to Dr. Anselm Lam for his kind invitation to participate this symposium. The topic of today is Zheng Buwei, the Kangxi Emperor, and the study of the I Ching and the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning. So first of all, I will give you a very brief introduction about the current research in the this field. And as you know, Father Fang Hao, who was a very famous historian of Christianity in China, and many years ago he published a book entitled "The Biographies of the Famous Person in the Chinese Christianity." And in this book, he mentions Xiaxin Buwei and his studies of the Book of Changes, I Ching, and Dr. von Colony, and he's now participating at this symposium. He has published a very famous book entitled Xiaxin Buwei, Sein Leben und sein Werk. This is a pioneer work working on Xiaxin Buwei using many European documents. And in 1996, the first Chinese archives in Beijing, they published many Manchu memorials, and many of them are about Xiaxin Buwei and his works at the Forbidden City. And in 1997, I first visited Rome, and I found many of Buwei's Chinese documents related to I Ching at the Vatican Library, the Borgia Cinesi, and the call number is 317. So from that time on, I began to work on Buwei and his study of the I Ching, and have published some papers on this topic. And in this years, many scholars in different countries, and especially in China, they have published many things on Buwei. So including Dr. like Li Zipeng in Hong Kong, Chinese University of Hong Kong. And as you know, Xiaxin Buwei was born in 1656, and he studied at the Jesuit College, and he was very interested in mathematics and physics. And during his youth, he was eager to go to China, following the steps of Francisco Xavier. And he joined the Society of Jesus in 1673. And then he was sent to China by the French King Louis XIV, and he arrived in Beijing in 1688 as one of the king's mathematicians. And during his stay in China, especially in 1688 to 1691, he was invited by the emperor to become a mathematic tutor. And he translated the Éléments de géométrie by Ignace Gaston Baptiste. And he also translated the European anatomy into Chinese and Manchu. And in 1693, 1699, he was sent to France as an imperial envoy in order to recruit more Jesuits to come to China. And his most famous book is the Portrait Historique, which was published in 1697. And in his career, the most important thing is that he had many correspondence with the German philosopher Leibniz, because Buwei read his book Novissima Sinica. And Buwei published many things besides his studies on the I Ching. And he also published a book about the Gujing Jingtianjian, so a very famous book at that time. So he served as a kind of imperial scholar at the Forbidden City. So he worked for the emperor for for many years. So he was the founder figurist, which a word which was coined by the French scholar, and together with some other Jesuits like Fouquet, Prémart, and Golay, and Henville. So this kind of work was have been done by Dr. von Colany and Dr. Rundbeck and Professor Witek, and recently Professor Mongello has published a new book about Jesuit Prémart, and Dr. Li Zipeng and some other scholars have also worked on them. Have done much research. So this is the content of my talk. Yeah. So from late 17th century on, the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning was very popular and influential. Its main point is that Western astronomical and mathematical sciences originated from China. So based on some new Chinese and Western sources, I would like to discuss the origin and development of this theory within its religious, scientific, and social context. Because of the Kangxi Emperor's interest in the I Ching, Book of Changes, the French Jesuit Yacine Bouvet was ordered to study it seriously. However, what was Bouvet's purpose? What did the emperor make use of Bouvet's writings? So as a case study, I will discuss Bouvet's aim in studying the I Ching and its relation to his accommodation policy in the spread of Christianity in China. I will also analyze his influence on Kangxi in the development of the theory. This will help to understand why the emperor supported the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning. Finally, I will give a description of the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning from a historical point of view, based on the study of Sino-Western cultural and scientific exchanges in the 17th and 18th centuries. So in the 1660s, the anti-Christianity movement launched by Yang Guangxian was a very important political, cultural, and scientific event in the early Qing period, which greatly influenced the course of Western science and religion in China. Kangxi was impressed by this conflict between Yang Guangxian and Adam Xiang Bell when he was still very young. So in the 玉质三角形推算法论 on the method of the triangle, published in 1703, he explained why he learned West sciences and continued to talk about the relationship between Western and Chinese traditional calendar. I quote, "Some believe that the ancient and modern methods are different. Actually, they do know the calendar deeply. The calendar which originated in China was transmitted to the far West. The Westerners kept it, made observation endlessly, and revised it every year. Therefore, their calendar is quite precise," end quote. So Kangxi proposed a theory of Chinese origin of West learning to counteract the serious negative effect of the anti-Christianity movement. To some extent, his purpose was to mitigate the dispute between Western and Chinese learning. On the other hand, it was also a good pretext for Chinese to learn Western learning, especially European mathematics and astronomy. After Maturich arrived in China, he found that China was a civilized country. Therefore, in order to accommodate the Christian doctrines with Chinese classics, he studied Chinese language and Confucian classics, wore clothes like Confucian scholars, and respected Chinese rites. Later on, most of the Jesuits followed religious accommodation policy, which was named as rules of Madrid, 立马的规矩, by the Kangxi Emperor during the Toulon's legation in China. So in 1688, Bouvet and other 4 French Jesuits arrived in Beijing as king's mathematicians. In addition to propagating Christian doctrines, they brought with them the task of making astronomical observations and of studying Chinese culture. So during his stay in China, Bouvet, together with some other Jesuits, taught the emperor the Éléments de géométrie written by Gaston Baptiste. He also translated several European books on anatomy into Manchu. In addition, he wrote the 古今今天鉴 in 1707, using Chinese ancient classics to confirm Christian doctrines. Many of his books on the I Ching in Chinese and Latin are still preserved in Europe. So as a missionary, Bouvet's task was to Christianize the Chinese people. He thought that the first step was to convert the emperor. Therefore, while he taught the emperor Western learning, he tried to find opportunities to explain Christian doctrines. He thought that it would be easier for Chinese to believe the Christian faith if someone could find in the Chinese classics identical views with Christian doctrines. So Bouvet's aim was to let Chinese know that they had the Christian doctrines in their ancient classics. So in his view, if the emperor had any doubt about the coincidence of Christianity and Confucianism, he would never allow the existence of Christianity in China. So it was therefore very important to identify the identical parts between the Christian doctrines and Chinese classics. If this could be done, Bouvet believed Kangxi might become converted. Bouvet's later work closely followed this guiding principle. So it is not clear when Bouvet began to study the I Ching. We do know that from 1701 on, he had correspondence with Leibniz on the subject, and they discussed Fuxi, Baguan, the 8 trigrams, and its relationship to the binary system. In 1711, the emperor ordered Bouvet to present his treatises on the I Ching. On the 5th March 1711, Bouvet mentioned in a letter that he wanted to show the emperor some mathematical ideas he got from studying the I Ching. He also introduced European science and mathematical knowledge, which he found in the I Ching. Many of his Chinese manuscripts related to the I Ching are preserved in the Vatican Library. We know from an imperial memorial that a catechist named Lu Zehan, a Juren, helped Bouvet a lot in the study of the I Ching. But most of the ideas were from Bouvet. So in the 易学外篇, Bouvet discussed the I Ching using the numerical principles and said that the diagram of 开方求脸图 included in the 算法统中, a book about abacus written by Ming mathematician Chen Dawei, was the same as that of the 借根方 method, a kind of algebra used by the mathematicians of the Western lands. Actually, Bouvet was trying to explain the Pascal triangle included in the 算法统中. So during that time, Kangxi was studying the 借根方 method and was interested in 算法统中. So therefore, Bouvet's explanation of Pascal triangle helped Kangxi to understand the 算法统中. So to some extent, Bouvet's explanation of the relationship between the 算法统中 and the Western algebra also provides the emperor with new evidence for the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning. So as mentioned above, from 1689 on, the Kangxi Emperor began to study very seriously Western science, including the element of the geometry, the logarithm, and algebra. But why was he interested in the I Ching, and why did he order Bouvet to study it? So it is clear from Bouvet's writings on the I Ching that it was Bouvet's detailed mathematical elaboration on the diagrams of Tianzhen, Dibei, and the formation of different magical squares in the Xuanfa Dongzong that allows the emperor to understand mathematical principles. Because of this, Kangxi became more interested in the I Ching and ordered a missionary to study on it. So Bouvet's interest in the I Ching just happened to meet the needs of the emperor. So in the meantime, Kangxi also ordered Grand Secretary Li Guangdi and a group of scholar officials to compile books related to the I Ching. So according to the Manchu memorials, the Zhouyi Zezong was presented in succession in 1713, 1714, and was published in 1715 by the Imperial Print House. So due to Kangxi's intermediary role between Bouvet and Li Guangdi, so Li Guangdi was able to read Bouvet's writings on the I Ching. So in Li Guangdi's memorial, he mentions that he had read something written by the missionaries. Bouvet would have been very gratified to know that his writings had been read by Chinese scholar officials like Li Guangdi and his students, so who had close relations with the Hanlin Academy in the compilation of the commentaries on the I Ching. So it is a very interesting to note that in Zhouyi Zezong, we can find a few paragraphs dealing with the numerical principles. Its compiler must have read Bouvet's writings on the I Ching, because the same material is in Bouvet's Latin manuscripts, which were sent to the Jesuit General Taburini. So this is a picture I got from Dr. von Kohlen's book. So we can see how Bouvet using the mathematical diagrams in the interpretation of the I Ching. So he also used the book written by the Chen Daweis, Ming mathematicians. Yeah. And except this, I also find a manuscript, a similar manuscript in Paris, the Jesuit archives. It's similar to Dr. Fonglan's the one. So from this we can we can see from this is a page from the Imperial book entitled Zhouyi Zezong, a book about the Book of Changes. So we can see the similar diagrams. So I think this is different pages from this book, and so we can see the similar diagrams. Like the right one is a kind of Pascal triangles. So this one, it was from Chen Daweis book Xuanfa Tongzong. So many of these diagrams in the imperial editions. So we are quite sure. So Xiaxing Bouvet must have played an important role because he interprets many things in his manuscript. Yeah. So Bouvet played a very important role in the interpretation of the I Ching, and then the Grand Secretary Li Guangdi and his students, they took some idea from Bouvet's the manuscript. So then they put them in the Chinese version of the 周易哲宗. Yeah. So Kangxi's deeper interest in the I Ching was an important factor that made Bouvet study it. So because of Bouvet's proximity to the emperor, he had a very close relationship with scholar officials. So Li Guangdi's writings on the I Ching were also submitted to Bouvet, as shown in Wang Daohua's memorial. I quote, Wang Daohua is the officer from the imperial household. Yeah, he's a very important person between the emperor and the missionaries. So Wang Daohua begins, I quote, Wang Daohua begs to report to your majesty as follows. On the 9th day, I respectfully received from your majesty a memorial of the Grand Minister Li Guangdi, a drawing and a section of explanatory book. I showed them to Bouvet. He respectfully read them. Bouvet said as follows. I'm deeply convinced that Grand Minister Li Guangdi has a good command of the principles of the I Ching and has a clear knowledge of calendrical sciences. So our emperor has a perfect understanding of ancient and modern knowledge, and especially goes into details in the learning of mathematical sciences. Now the Grand Secretary Li Guangdi is so erudite. He's really a virtuous and able prime minister of the sage monarch. So I'm really a Confucian scholar from Western lands. So that's words from Bouvet. And finally, Wang Daohua said, in addition, I submit a section on the I Ching explained by Bouvet and a diagram. So according to what Bouvet has said, this section I now present was probably much the same as that responded to the Grand Secretary. So this proves that Bouvet played a very important role in the imperial compilation of the 周易哲宗. So after Kangxi proposed a theory of Chinese origin of Western learning in 1703, no further mention was made of it until 1711. So in the second month of 1711, he issued an order to Zhao Hongxie, the governor of three provinces, putting forward a new idea. I quote, the mathematical principles are all from the I Ching. Also, the Western mathematical method is good as well. Actually, it came from China. They call it Zhubar algebra, which means that is from the East. The 算法是里接触的易经, that's what the Kangxi Emperor said. So in the 10th month of the next year, Kangxi spoke to Li Guangdi. I quote, did you ever discuss the numerical principles in the I Ching with other people? The mathematical method of books is identical with the numerical principles in the I Ching. So end quote. So in the guide to the use of the 周易哲宗, Kangxi also said, I quote, besides what I've lectured and studied, I have been absorbed absorbed in the secrets of calendrical science and the 9 chapters for many years. I know for certain that they do not go beyond the principles of the I Ching. So, 正讲诀之外，以立象九章之奥，有心有念，焕然自起，不出一道. So he puts the mathematical principles and so he understands there are mathematical principles included in the Book of Changes. So Kangxi comments here are the same as what he told Zhao Hongxie. So after having analyzed what Kangxi had said at that time, it's clear that his views were influenced by Bouvet. Because his views were expressed simultaneously with Bouvet's introduction of the numerical principles in the I Ching. It is also significant that Bowie and other Jesuits introduced Leibniz articles on the binary system to Kangxi. So therefore, it is sufficient to say that Bowei's study of the I Ching contributed to the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning. Now I come to the concluding remarks. So also Bowei's idea on the I Ching seemed to be very bizarre and heretical. She reflected many aspects of the encounter between Western and Chinese cultures. Bowie could be regarded as a cultural middleman. He believes that all Christian mysteries were revealed in the Chinese classics. His aim was to integrate Christian doctrines with Chinese culture. So in this way, he tried to convert the emperor and therefore make the Chinese believe Christianity. On the other hand, the accommodation policy really influenced the emperor. Consequently, it stimulated the spread of the theory of the Chinese origin of Western learning. Also, this was probably contrary to Bowei's intention. So because of Kangxi's involvement in Western science, European astronomy and mathematics were preeminent in China in the late 17th century. Kangxi believes that Western methods were much more precise than Chinese methods. He did not change his view on Western astronomy until 1711, when he found out that the results of the Tribunal of Mathematics were not precise. From that time on, he began to ask the Jesuits to compile new astronomical and mathematical books. So after the anti-Christianity movement, some xenophobic Chinese officials opposed Christian doctrines. The emperor was afraid of giving offense to high officials and his subjects by supporting Christianity publicly. He also expressed this view when he talked with the Jesuits. Consequently, Kangxi's advocacy of the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning was a good strategy, not only in convincing the Chinese to accept Chinese Western science, but also in mitigating the officials' previous opposition to Christianity. So therefore, the theory played a leading role in reconciling the conflict between Western and Chinese learning. So this is probably why Bowei's writings were accepted by the emperor. So this phenomenon was reflected not only in science, but also in culture and religion. So it was a result of Chinese-Western cultural confrontation. So therefore, for the better understanding of Bowei's study of the I Ching, it is necessary to consider the social and the religious context. So Bowei's new efforts using mathematics helped in the interpretation of the I Ching. So some 18th century Chinese scholars tried to study the traditional sciences based on Western science. So putting forward the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning made the Chinese literati realize that the Chinese traditional science still had some strong points as compared with Western sciences. So therefore, it was worth their propagating them in order to gain self-confidence. So this led to much new research by Chinese scholars in the field of traditional mathematical sciences. So the mathematicians at that time devoted their lives to the study of mathematics and calendar sciences. So this is a new approach to the traditional mathematics melded the Western mathematical method introduced into China. This reflects the new tendency of the times, which helped the Chinese to better understand their own traditional sciences. So since the introduction of Western science into China in late Ming and early Qing period. Most Chinese scholars believe that Western sciences were far superior to the Chinese sciences. Therefore, the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning retrieved Chinese reputation in the field of mathematical sciences and pushed forward the revival of Song and Yuan mathematics in the late 18th and 19th centuries. So to a great extent, it contributed a lot to the encounter of Western learning with Chinese civilization. However, the theory of Chinese origin of Western learning also had a negative factor. It fostered the blind worship of the traditional sciences. So as a result, the Chinese could not make a sober estimate of the state of Chinese sciences and were not aware of the rapid progress of science in Europe. So all this factor hindered the development of sciences in China. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Han. Now we know there is a lot of mathematical knowledge hidden in I Ching, and it had much value in the spread of Christianity, right? And now we also know the story between Kangxi, Prof, and other people like Li Guangdi. Thank you very much. Now we come to the second talk. The speaker is Dr. Chicheng MA. Dr. Ma is assistant professor of economics at the University of Hong Kong. His research areas are in development economics and economic history, focusing on the roles of historical culture, institutions, and human capital in the long-run economic and financial development. The context of his research are primarily the economic history of China and the Sino-West contact since the 15th century. The topic he's going to talk about today is knowledge diffusion and intellectual change when Chinese literati met European Jesuits. Let's welcome Dr. Ma.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wang, for your introduction. I also thank Dr. Len for invitation. My big honor, and also thank Lucia for your excellent coordination. So I'm so thrilled to speak to historians and experts of religious study because I'm not a historian, I'm just an economist, but my research context is basically comparative history between China and the West before the 20th century. My aim is that by making use of new historical data and the new statistical tool, I try to provide some new empirical evidence and insights to some big or general economic questions. For example, this paper actually tried to address a big question in economics, that is, well, what's the economic determinants of the human capital change? And in this literature, economists always want to find out some exogenous shock in the knowledge exchange or knowledge diffusion. And in the context of historical China, the coming of the Jesuits just provided such an excellent and ideal context to examine how the knowledge exchange or clash changed the developmental path of human capital in the later period. So this is a major motivation of this paper, and I'm very happy to present with many great scholars like Professor Han Qi. Here, I read Professor Han's book, very fantastic about how the Jesuits introduced the Western astronomy to China. Yeah, so in this paper, I believe most historians know this fascinating history about the so-called first wave of cultural clash or knowledge clash between China and Western Europe. That's the Jesuits coming to China, introducing science and religion to Chinese intellectuals. So Why we call this as a wave of clash? Because at the time of the Jesuits coming, the Ming Dynasty of China was basically autarkic or isolated himself from the outside, from the West, the so-called sea ban or trade ban, 海禁政策. So, well, in the intellectual realm, Chinese literati or scholar officials basically stayed in a relatively, autarkic or isolated environment with little communication with the Western intellectual realm. But the coming of the Jesuits broke such autarkic regime, introducing European sciences to these Chinese elites. Many 进士 degree holders, scholar officials, they were the most gifted or talented people in China. So we want to say, well, what's the possible impact of the Jesuit science on Chinese literates' scientific effort and production? Of course, historians have told us many excellent, fantastic evidences in terms of this. Mostly case or examples like Matthew Rich's communication with Xu Guangqi and many others. But for economists, we want to know whether or not there's a systematic impact from the Western introduction of new knowledge on Chinese scientific production. In other words, we want to find out whether or not there's some statistical relationship in addition to the very eminent examples like Xu Guangqi, like others. So by doing so, we aim to abstract some rule in terms of the relation between knowledge exchange on the one hand and the human capital development on the other. So by doing so, we can contribute a new empirical evidence to the development economics. So this is a motivation. Well, for economic history of China, I think this paper can help us understand the fundamental reason of a big question in comparative economic history between China and Europe. That's the so-called, it's a very famous Needham puzzle, why Chinese science fell behind the European science after basically the 14th century, according to Needham, right? So this is still an unresolved puzzle for economists, social scientists, and historians. So in economics, a prevailing hypothesis is that, well, relative to the European intellectuals, the Chinese literati in the Ming and Qing dynasties lacked the interest of studying science, especially the new science from the West, to borrow their words, to learn from the barbarian, right? So this is a kind of a Confucian cultural triumphalism. So such a cultural norm or classical worship made the Chinese literati kind of bad learner. But meanwhile, in the Europe, we know because of the Enlightenment movement, well, they experienced the rise of modern science, technology, and the application of the useful knowledge to engineering to the industry, which in turn laid the intellectual foundation of the Industrial Revolution. But they think that Chinese intellectuals or the talent lacked such culture, such spirit. Okay, they just resist any new things. Of course, this is just a relative concept, relative to the European counterparts. Well, another reason of behind the lack of interest in modern science is because of the civil service examination or 科举 system in Ming-Qing dynasty. We know the 科举 system was perhaps the only way of social success, to borrow He Bingdi's words, the land of success, right? So this system absorbed almost all the talents people to the bureaucratic system to compete for entering the bureaucracy or the gentry class. So for this purpose, they had to study the Confucian classics, mostly, natural philosophy, moral philosophy, or literacy works Of course, there are also some signs like Book of Changes and others, but relative to the European counterparts, well, this system in China made the Chinese literati relatively, lack certain interest in new science and technology. Well, of course, social scientists, historians also provided many good examples, cases in support of this conventional wisdom, but systematic or statistical evidence still remains scant. Well, in this paper, we want to make use of the Jesuits coming to systematically examine whether or not the Chinese literati really lack scientific interest. If so, we should find that, well, the coming of the Jesuits and their diffusion of European new sciences should not have a significant statistical impact on Chinese literati scientific effort. Otherwise, if we find there's a very positive, significant impact, we can question this conventional wisdom, okay? Actually, that's the main finding of this paper. The main finding of this paper is that I document a positive impact of the Jesuit sciences on Chinese sciences during the period of the Jesuits in China. So specifically, I find that Chinese literati had very positive responses to European sciences. I mean systematically or statistically, okay? So this coincides with historians' arguments that there was a revival of Chinese science after the late 16th century, okay? However, unfortunately, China lost the chance of catching up European sciences in the new industrial century or the Newtonian century. Why? Because of the rise controversy between the Qing Emperor of China and the Catholic Pope. Well, the Yongzheng Emperor expelled all the Jesuits missionaries from China to Macau and later to Europe. Okay, in other words, China's door or window for intellectual exchange with Europe was closed again by the imperial authorities. Well, later, according to historians' studies, Chinese science tend to kind of a backlooking fashion. They began to absorb the Jesuits' European science into the Chinese Confucian or classical scientific system. So this scientific stagnation sustained until the late 19th century, when China encountered a new wave of knowledge exchange. Well, that's the Protestant diffusion of modern science to China. Then China began to modernize. Modern industries, modern banks, and modern schools and books were introduced to China. That's why we call that period as modern China. So this is the long timeline of the Sino-West intellectual contact. Well, so based on this finding, some possible implications of this paper is that, first, in terms of the Needham puzzle, we don't think that a main reason lies in Chinese literati's lack of interest or lack of interest in science or learning from the West. In contrast, we find that Chinese literati systematically, positively responded to the Jesuit science to try to revise Chinese traditional science. So instead, this paper suggests that a very important reason behind the Needham puzzle might be institutional. That is the imperial authorities' communication policy with the West, with the Europe. And we find that once the Chinese literati got the chance of communication with the Western intellectuals, well, they could produce some new scientific work. And later, when the door was closed, well, we can find the Chinese scientific production shrank or tend to a new stagnation. So later I will show you some data evidence in this respect. So this also illuminates the modernization or the rise of industrial power in China after the forced opening up after British defeated the Qing dynasty in the First Opium War. So, okay, this is a possible implication for economic history. For general economic questions, as I mentioned in the very beginning, so this paper provides a new historical evidence in terms of the importance of knowledge diffusion in economic or human capital development. Okay, so previous study basically focused on contemporary data, very noisy, right? And based on European data, but later evidence on the China side. And also contribute to the literature on how the mission affected long-run economic development in the world. Well, you may find the missionary economics is a rising field in economics. Now, scholars began to recognize that many contemporary variations or inequalities in economic development across region or across groups actually can be traced back to their missionary history in the world, in the past. So this is a studies about the long-run persistent impact of historical events on contemporary development. So this paper also contribute to this literature from Chinese experience. Well, next, let me briefly introduce this history, and I believe most of you have known very well about this Jesuit history in China. But I focus on statistical evidence. I hope this can provide some new pattern, new picture, or new insights to the current literature. So this graph shows us the temporal change in terms of the total number of Jesuit missionaries in China, based on a well-known book written by Joseph Durner on the biographies of the Jesuits in China from the mid-16th to early 19th century. So yeah, you can find the data pattern is quite consistent with historians' description about the rise and fall of the Jesuits in China. So from after Matthew Rich's exploration of China inland, well, the number of Jesuits reached the peak around 1700. And later, from basically 1720, when Kangxi Emperor Yongzheng Emperor began to, persecute and expel the Jesuits, well, the Jesuit mission in China tended to decline. And finally, in the late 18th century, the Catholic Church closed the Jesuit mission, the Society for Jesus. So the Jesuit mission in China completely disappeared or ended. Well, this is the cross-sectional or spatial distribution of the number of Jesuit missions in China. And I also divide them by major period of the Jesuit visit in China. You can find that in around 1600, well, Matthew Ricci and some of other his colleagues only, successfully established their preaching stations in some big cities in China, like Nanking, like Nanchang, and also Zhaoqing and Canton province. And of course, later they successfully arrived at Beijing and stabilized the Jesuit mission in China. So after that, they began to expand the Jesuit mission to other cities of China. So you may find by 1700, most major or big cities in Ming China, in Qing China, had Jesuit missionary stations. And later, declined. The Jesuit mission retreated from China. So this paper's focus is about the scientific diffusion of the Jesuit society, right, in China. So I needed to find out who were diffusing science in China and who did not within the Jesuit missionaries. So for this purpose, I carefully checked the biography of each Jesuit missionary in China, and finally, document identified a total of 443 Jesuits in China, among whom less than 100 or even much less actually got involved in the scientific activities. So for easy viewing, I depict them in the map in terms of their visiting places. So the cross represents the pure Jesuit priests, meaning that these Jesuit missionaries only, preached Chinese rather than diffusing any science. And the bubble represents the location of the Jesuit scientists, meaning that these Jesuits diffused the scientific works or scientific instruments or involved in deep communications with Chinese literati in terms of European science in that period. So you can find there's a very striking regional pattern in terms of the distributions of these two types of Jesuit missionaries, okay? So this enables us to efficiently examine the possible impact of the Jesuit science on Chinese literati's scientific production, rather than, picking up the effect from the Jesuit mission or Jesuit preaching on Chinese science. So this can enable us to estimate a relatively pure effect from the scientific exchange between the Jesuits and the Chinese. Yeah. So I still need to explain a little bit about the reason behind the Jesuits' scientific endeavor in China. So why the Catholic missionaries wanted to use science as their instrument to preach China, right? So, of course, a necessary condition is about the Society of Jesus. It's a very scholarly Catholic order, right? Many great scholars, great scientists in the Jesuit society at that time. And because of this advantage, the Jesuit society adopted a scientific strategy, missionary strategy in China. They wanted to use science to try to pursue the Chinese literati in order to establish the prestige of Catholic Church in Chinese Confucian land. This is a main purpose, okay? Yeah, of course, I trust most of you know this. I will not elaborate a lot. So in terms of the specific scientific activities, they mainly translated many European scientific works and introducing scientific instruments and the new inventions at some time, for example, mechanical clocks, right? And of course, a more popular, prevalent form of communication is to work together with the Chinese literati. For example, they collectively translated many scientific books from Europe side, right? Yeah. So by here, I want to emphasize the importance of the face-to-face or in-person communication between the two groups of intellectuals. This will, promote or stimulate the new idea or new scientific works. So this is a rough statistics about the yearly distribution of the number of translations of European sciences translated by the Jesuits in collaboration with some Chinese scholars. We can find the early 17th century saw the peak of the translation of European sciences, okay? And yeah, I will skip these evidences, okay? And they also introduced some advanced scientific instrument to China, like this one, the very famous Beijing Observatories with the new celestial instrument, okay, introduced by Nan Huairen, a very famous Jesuit scientist in China. yeah, these instruments are still there today. And also, by the late 17th century, the Jesuits' Chinese intellectual interaction reached a new peak, a new climax upon the arrival of the French king's mathematicians, right? The French king sent many academicians from the Royal Academy in Paris to China to help the Kangxi Emperor to revise Chinese agriculture calendar, celestial system, and also the mapping the border of the empire and also across the provinces. So this is the golden age during which Chinese scientists learned from the European about the scientific frontier in the ancient period. And of course, we can find many anecdotal evidence about Chinese literature response to the Jesuit science. And we can find there are many positive response from Xu Guangqi, from others. We can find this evidence from their writing, from their notes. So I will not elaborate on this. So to summarize, the current historical studies suggest that the Chinese scholars tried to revisit and revise or improve traditional Chinese science by introducing the new European methods, especially in the astronomy and the mathematical field. Okay, so other scholars also call this period as the rise of concrete studies. Chinese knowledge elites began to recognize the importance of the usefulness of the knowledge. Okay, but their application of science or new knowledge actually mainly lied in the statecraft rather than in the experiment or industry, which I will elaborate on further. Well, so here, let me show you a piece of statistical evidence about the increase in Chinese scientific productions after the Jesuits coming. So here, basically from 1580, the Jesuit mission or Jesuit scientists successfully entered China mainland, right? You can find that in the prefectures or cities where there were Jesuit scientists, meaning that the local scholars could communicate with these Jesuit scientists for the new science. So the Chinese scientific works, meaning the scientific works written by Chinese scholars only, well, increased a lot, right? However, before the coming of the Jesuits, in the prefectures with Jesuit scientists, eventually, okay, well, there was no significant difference between this Jesuit prefecture and non-Jesuit prefectures in terms of the Chinese scientific production. Look, no systematic difference, right? The only difference or the rise of the scientific work only appeared after the Jesuits coming. This is a descriptive evidence about the timing of the Chinese scientific rise in accordance with the Jesuits coming. So which is consistent with our hypothesis in terms of the positive impact of Jesuit science on China, right? So then the breakdown, the break of knowledge diffusion after the expulsion of Jesuits by imperial authorities because of the Chinese rise of controversy. So according to historians' account, Chinese science began to decline, especially in the research contents. It tended to a kind of backward-looking pattern. Okay, so by here, okay, it's very good, but all are descriptive evidence or case evidence or stories. We want to know systematically whether or not there is a rule, there is a systematic relationship between the Jesuit science on the one hand and the Chinese science on the other. Okay, so by making use of the data I introduced above, now I can run a statistical regression analysis. Here, the dependent variable on the left hand is the number of Chinese scientific books, the book titles, okay? And the main independent or explanatory variable is the geographic distribution of the Jesuit scientists. If the coefficient of the Jesuit scientists tend to significantly positive after the time of the Jesuits coming in 1580, then we will be quite sure that it's a Jesuit effect that caused the rise of Chinese science. Of course, to rule out some confounding noisy factors that may simultaneously affect both the Jesuits distribution on the one hand and the Chinese scientific distribution on the other, we need too many controls. So like the physical or medical experiment, we need a control group or control factors, control everything we can. So here we control for many geographic factors, right? Like distance to coast, distance to river, distance to courier route, because this will affect the Jesuits' residential places, right? As well as economic prosperity, population size, and the human capital stock of China, like the number of 进士 degree holders, right? So these variables are accessible and measurable. So we have controlled for lots of such confounding factors. The purpose is to try to isolate the real impact of the Jesuit distribution on the distribution of Chinese scientific works.
Okay,
so
Dr. Ma, 3 minutes left. Sorry.
Okay, okay,
Sorry.
Perfect. I believe I can finish that. So this is main regression results based on this specification. Here, the stars meaning the level of significance. So you may find the effect of the distribution of Jesuits is quite significant, and the coefficient is quite positive. So if we interpret this, we can see that, okay, look at the panel B, when we use the Jesuit scientist number to predict the Chinese scientific works, we can see that an additional number of Jesuit scientists in this specific prefecture will increase Chinese scientific books, I mean book titles, by 0.024 per year per prefecture, okay? Of course, this sounds a very trivial effect, but if you evaluate this by the sample mean, it will be a big percentage change. I will skip these technical details. And the placebo test, which we borrow from medical study, well, here we use Chinese literates liberal arts works and the placebo group, meaning that the number of book titles written by Chinese literati in the field of history and literature. Okay, because these works had little to do with science, right? So we should not expect a significant impact of Jesuit science on this liberal arts work. Well, you can find, yes, very consistent with our hypothesis, okay? It doesn't matter. So this reinforces the result of this table. It's really an effect from the knowledge exchange in science, right? Yeah, so in terms of the expulsion effect, we can find after the Jesuits were expelled by the Chinese emperor after 1720, so the previous significant impact of Jesuit scientists disappeared here. The stars all gone, right? So finally, I also discussed, well, since the Jesuits promoted Chinese scientific work, but why finally China still had no scientific revolution, no industrial revolution, right? So this is a puzzle. Of course, this is a big question beyond the scope of this paper, but according to historians' wisdom, we can see that a possible reason lies in the contents of science or the nature of science of the Jesuits, because the Jesuit science actually were hardly to be identified as modern science, right? But kind of traditional science, focusing on astronomy and mathematics, rather than the engineering and many other new science and technologies useful for industrial revolution, right? So that's why if we run regression, if we use Jesuit science to predict the later industrial firms in China in the early 20th century, we could not find a significant relationship. Instead, the Chinese industrial development from the late 19th century was mainly driven by the knowledge introduction from the Protestants. They introduced the new technology from the industrial world in the West. Also, the literati scientific research mainly focused on the statecrafts rather than the practical or industrial field. And in other words, Chinese classical scholarship system was not challenged by the Jesuit science. Instead, Chinese classical system absorbed the Jesuit science to the traditional system instead of developing it after, the shutdown of the door of intellectual change by the emperor. So again, this stressed the importance of the openness to knowledge frontier or openness to knowledge idea flow in the progress of human capital and science. So this historical episode provides us a very good evidence or insights for the importance of knowledge exchange. So this is the main finding of this paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. His study overturned our conventional and, in fact, wrong impression that Chinese intellectual lacked a scientific mind. Right? Thank you very much. And now let us come to this third talk. The speaker is Father Agustin UDÍAS. Let me introduce him. Agustin UDÍAS, Jesuit, Professor Emeritus of Geophysics at Universidad Complutense de Madrid, has held research and teaching posts at the University of California, Berkeley, Wolfgang Goethe Universität, Frankfurt am Main, and Universidad de Barcelona. He has published several books, among them Principles of Seismology, Ciencia y Religión, sorry for my bad Spanish pronunciation, meaning Science and Religion, Jesuit Contribution to Science, a History, and Ciencia y Fe Cristiana en la Historia, meaning Science and Christian Faith in History. The topic Father UDÍAS is going to share with us is the role of Jesuit scientists in missionary work. Let us pass the floor to Father UDÍAS.
Well, first of all, I want to thank very much the organizers for this invitation to participate in this important conference. My work how can I change the presentation? Yeah. The first idea that I want to put forward is that the Jesuit scientific participation in missionary work was not just a personal endeavor, so that some particular Jesuit scientists did work in the missionary lands, but it was an institutional, really, participation, so that the use of scientific knowledge in connection with missionary work was actually a policy that was followed by Jesuits, and it was followed by Jesuits in the early times, that is to say, from the 16th to 18th century, and also in modern times in the 19th and 20th century. Also, I have to emphasize that he took very different forms in the different countries and at the different times. So it's a little bit complex, the problem. May I change the maybe the better known and the earliest of this work of Jesuit scientists in missionary work is that of the Jesuit astronomers in China. And we have heard in the two previous lectures something about them, especially Matteo Ricci. He presented himself as a mathematician and an astronomer to the learned man and to the court in China, and gave learned access to the precisely to these parts of the English of the Chinese culture, precisely because of that presentation. And very early, Ricci began publication of books on mathematics and astronomy, especially the translation of the Euclid's geometry to Chinese. And also he became aware of the errors of the official calendar, was a complicated lunar solar calendar, and precisely he asked Rome to send Jesuits to China. They were well with good knowledge of mathematics and astronomy to help in the new calendar. Further on, it's very important to realize that Jesuits became directors of the Imperial Observatory in Peking. The first one was Johann Adam von Bell, who became the first Jesuit director, and was the one who finished the reform of the calendar that was proclaimed in 1641. His successor was Ferdinand Vermist, a Belgian Jesuit, who became the closest advisor of the Emperor Kanzi for all kinds of affairs, not only scientific. And they remain as directors of the observatory even during the 18th century, when Jesuits in general were expelled from China, but the ones that were responsible of the observatory remain, and the last one was Agustin von Harstein, who assumed the direction of the observatory in 1742. An interesting relation between the missionary work and the scientific work by the Jesuits in China is in the words of Vermist. I will read it. The Christian religion in China is justly represented as the most august queen who appears publicly with her arms leaning on astronomy, while the other mathematical science crowd around it. Therefore, here we have by Vermist a very clear indication that the missionary work, the presentation of Christian faith, was in China brought about by the astronomy. He said Christian science, Christian faith was first introduced in China through astronomy, very strongly statement, because he was left untouched thanks to astronomy, and because after having been banished several times, he is referring to the time during the Emperor Kanxi when Jesuits were expelled, she was called back each time and successfully restored to her former dignity by astronomy. A different story is the ones of the Jesuit astronomers in India. And it's very similar in one aspect, but very different. They worked between the 17th and the 18th century, and they carry out a collaboration with especially the Raja of Amber and Jaipur, Sawai Jai Singh, and they were especially French Jesuit astronomers like Claude Boudier, François Pont, and Antoine Gabelsberger. And then also the German Gabelsberger and Strobel. They brought new astronomical tables to China and helped the Indian astronomers with their observation and calculations. We have there a picture of the Jesuits bringing the astronomical tables to the Sawai Jai Singh. Therefore, as in China, Jesuit astronomers were instrumental in opening the door of the learned circles in India to Christian religion. Another aspect of the use of science in missionary work in India and China is the cartography. In China, Ritchie's world map became very popular. It was the first world map with modern, made in modern way that was presented for the first time to the Chinese culture. Later, Michel Benoit participated in forming the collection of maps known as the Atlas of Kanji between 1690 and 1720. The same happened also in India with the drawings of the first geographical maps of India, especially by Joseph Tiefenthaler, the German Jesuit. And maps were used not only by missionaries, but later by European cartographers, maps of China and India. A very different relation between science and missionary work is that in America, mostly South America, with the work of the Jesuit naturalists and cartographers. So it's a different attitude. Now we have not Jesuits coming to very already developed cultural nation like China and India, but going into non-developed countries in South America. What they did also in the scientific part of his work was to bring to Europe the knowledge of the land, fauna, and flora of these new lands, and that gave an interesting projection to the knowledge of the America situations as naturalists. That meant also as propaganda about Jesuit missionary work. It was also a source for their financing. Their mathematical training allowed them also to draw the first modern maps of those lands with exact observations of the latitude and longitude, and they serve an expansion of missionary work on those vast lands. Thus, Jesuit missionaries became in America the first explorers, geographers, cartographers, naturalists, and anthropologists. So we have here a very different relation between, say, scientific work and the missionary work than we have seen before in China and India. The most important of the and the first of the Jesuit naturalists is Jose de Acosta, who described the natural lands, the fauna and the flora of America, and published a book in 1590. There was the book Historia Natural Oral de las Indias, which became very popular and was translated immediately into French, Italian, German, Netherlands, and Latin. It's very important to consider that Acosta thought of his naturalist work of the Historia Natural, natural history of the South America, as part and help of the missionary work, because he has written before a book on how to carry out the missionary work in America, the Procuranda in Dorum Salute. And precisely, he considers his second book was this natural history as a help to the missionary work. So it was explicitly said that we will say the scientific part of the work of the Jesuit was a help to the missionary work. After Acosta, there were many studies of natural work in America and became very numerous. And they also had a practical aspect for their use in the medicine. In that, they took also an interesting relation with the American medicine men, witch doctors and shamans, and this aspect of using precisely the plants of America for medical use was very useful for missionary work. There are many naturalists who publish works about the natural aspects of South America. Among them, we can quote Bernabé Cobo with History of the New World, Cristobal de Acuña with a work about the Amazon River, was the first description of the fauna and the flora found along the river. He made a trip from the fountains to the end of the river. And Jose Gumilla, who wrote about another river, the Orinoco River, and Alonso de Valle, who wrote about Chile. As we saw that the Jesuits carry out also a cartography we saw in China and India, but it was much more important the cartography they carry out in America, because they were the first many times of producing maps that covered the whole region, from the north in California and Arizona to the south in Patagonia and south of Chile. And they were, in many instances, the first to be made of these regions. It's very important that is the first maps already made with modern observations of latitude and longitude were made by Jesuits at that time. This way, these maps also were a great help in the missionary work to situate the missions, mission locations, and also to find out the best ways to travel between them, because at that time there was no other maps, and it was very difficult to move, especially in the Amazon parts of South America, from one mission location to another without any maps. So these maps were very important also for the strictly missionary work. We have up to now talked about most of the work done in the old society, and it's the society of the 17th and 18th century, before it was suppressed in 1774 by the Pope. The society was restored in 1814, and there was a new missionary work. And in this missionary work, there is also an apportation of science to the missionary work. But this is now in a different way. And among the different apportations of scientific work to the missionary work, the most important at that time is that of the new Jesuit observatories that were created in the missions. We have to realize that in the meteorology and the seismology parts of these observatories were very important in countries that were prone to frequent hurricanes and earthquakes. They were in South America, for example, and they provided an invaluable service. Observatories were thus an important help in missionary work. We have to take this into account. First, those observatories in mission countries were Manila in Philippines, Chicheng, China, Tananarive, Madagascar, and Sara, Lebanon. In first part, we have the observatories in Africa. The most important Jesuit observatory in Africa was that of Madagascar, that was created in 1889. It was, I think, the first observatory created in Africa. And it was created precisely at the plateau at more than 1,000 meters high sea level. And it was run by Jesuits until 1967. Another Jesuit observatory was created in 1903 in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. And Jesuits also managed an observatory in Africa, in Addis Ababa, that was actually a state institution. In Asia, the observatories, the first one was established in Manila, Philippines, in 1865. And it was very especially dedicated to meteorology and astronomical observations. Another observatory that is less known was created in India in St. Xavier College in Calcutta in 1866. So we see these are very early observatories. And in 1871 began the Observatory of Chicheng near Shanghai. It was in China, and the Jesuits, the French Jesuits, which created it, considered it to be a continuation of the work we saw before of the Jesuits being the directors of the Astronomical Observatory in Peking. He was devoted mainly to meteorology, and in 1900, it was created his Observatory was only astronomical observatory. A complete different story about Jesuits, scientists, and missionary work is that of the Jesuits biologists in India. Jesuits in India established a brilliant series of botanical studies. The first was by Ethelbert Blatter. It was the first at St. Xavier College in Mumbai, where he established a collection of nearly 3 million plants, which are known today as the Blatter Herbarium. And he created this tradition of studies of botany among Jesuits in India. Botany and environmental and ecological studies continue to be taught today in many of the Jesuit Indian colleges. For example, in those of St. Xavier's, Mumbai, St. Xavier's, Ahmedabad, Loyola, Chennai, St. Joseph, Tiruchirappalli, St. Aloysius, Bangalore, St. Xavier, Calcutta, and St. Xavier, Alayamankotai. Today, there's a very important number of Jesuits working in biology in India. One will be a little bit surprised of this connection between scientific work and missionary work by Jesuits, and naturally even Jesuits themselves were not very particularly impressed by the necessary work of the scientists. Many Jesuits working in missions thought that the important work was the direct missionary work. But we have precisely the Jesuit general superiors making it clear that the scientific work was truly missionary work. We have two quotations here by two general fathers, Luis Martin in the 19th century. The studies of our brothers in the observatory, he was talking about the Manila Observatory, result not only in the advance of science and the honor of our society, but also are useful to a scholar and contribute to the help of the souls. His successor, Vladimir Tedokovsky, also was very interested naturally, and he tried to answer precisely to the critical position of some Jesuits in China that didn't consider the work of the observatory in Chicheng as very missionary. And he wrote, "I consider very adequate to promote the greater glory of God through the scientific prestige that the observatory, Chicheng, has obtained among people, especially mariners of the eastern countries." So you see that the leading general fathers of the society were understanding the relation between science and missionary work. So finally, we can conclude that first in China, Jesuit knowledge of mathematics and astronomy opened to them and the Christian message the door of the learned circles and the imperial court, and they became the directors of the imperial observatory. And in this way, they promote the missionary work. And in a lesser scale, the same happened in India with the work of Jesuit astronomers. In the American missions, their work had a different character, and Jesuits became the first to study the new lands, its fauna and flora, and made them on to Europe. Maps of the new lands necessary for missionary work were also made by Jesuit scientists. Then, in modern times, main Jesuit scientific work in mission land was associated with the establishment of observatories, which were in many cases the first scientific institutions in some countries. This is very important to stress that many of these mission countries didn't have any observatories at all, and the first one were those established by the Jesuits. They had the missionary work with their scientific prestige in countries precisely with few scientific institutions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Father UDÍAS. Thank you for bringing us an overview, or I would say a big historical point of view of the history of Jesuit scientists. And it is not only about China, but also different places of the world like India, America, Africa, and not only about astronomy and mathematics, but also about biology, seismology, medicine, and cartology. Thank you very much. And now we have several minutes for the panelist discussion and DNA. And so let me see. Let me ask Professor UDÍAS, Professor Han, and Dr. Ma. Do you have questions for each other?
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Ma.
Hi, Professor Han.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your fascinating talk. So I'm just curious, how do you differ as the priest, a Jesuit priest and a Jesuit scientist? Because you have a table of distribution of the Jesuit priest and the Jesuit scientists. Because sometimes it's very difficult which Jesuit was a scientist or not. So that's my question. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Han. This is indeed a very crucial question. Here, by Jesuit scientists, we mainly refer to those who notably contributed to Chinese science by, for example, by translating books, by introducing some astronomical instruments to China. And this is mainly based on the description in their biography. So if their biography did not mention their scientific activities, so I deliberately, think that these are just priests rather than scientists. And second, I cross-checked this name list of Jesuit scientists with another book written by Professor Li Di about the historical Chinese scientists. I forgot the exact Chinese book title. So basically, the distribution and the name list are consistent between these two sources. So, and of course, there must be some measurement errors. Maybe some priests were actually scientists, but were not manifested in their biography, so they are omitted. Yeah, I acknowledge this possible error in this data. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So, Professor Han, I'm just curious. So it's very fascinating to know the Chinese origin of the Western science, right? The Jesuits introduced the Chinese science back to Europe to affect the European scientific studies. So to my knowledge, they not only translated the Chinese science, but also some other Chinese classics, right? Like some books written in the ancient time, the so-called 5 classics in Chinese system. So whether or not these Chinese classics also affected their scientific production in Europe, and moreover, whether or not these translations also affected their liberal arts work. For example, Voltaire admired the Chinese philosophy and the Chinese civil service examination so much, he always promoted to improve the European civil service system by following the Chinese model. So whether or not this is the case in your view?
Yes, that's a very good question. So as far as I know, for instance, French thinkers of Enlightenment, they read many books written by Jesuits at that time, but I'm not quite sure if the French, for instance, the French astronomers, if they got some idea from such kind of translations of 5 classics, something like that. But anyway, they used some translation of astronomical books or data. For instance, a French Jesuit, Antoine Gobille, he translated many parts or chapters from Sangshu, and this book was the manuscript are still still preserved in the Observatoire de Paris, and some French astronomers around 1800, like Laplace, he used some astronomical data translated by Antoine Gobille, but I'm not quite sure if some ideas they influenced the European scholars or not. But some scientific data, for instance, the summer solstice, from the Chinese traditional text, they were used by Laplace. So that's my answer. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you.
So I can see one question in the chat box from Charles Chu, right? And also Professor Lam has put up his hand. Okay, let us take a look at the question in the chat box first. The Jesuits are well known in astronomy and mathematics as reviewed in the presentation. How about the study of earth sciences such as oceanography and tectonics? I think this question is addressed to Father UDÍAS, right?
Yeah, exactly the question. What is your question exactly?
Okay, let me repeat. The Jesuits are well known in astronomy and mathematics. In your presentation, how about the study of earth sciences such as oceanography and tectonics?
Yeah, well, we have to distinguish really between the first society and the modern society. Earth science really starts as a scientific modern endeavor in the 19th century. So earth science belongs more to the second part of my presentation, which is modern Jesuits. And there, precisely, Jesuits had a very important part in the development of seismology, precisely. At the time, I would say about 1940, there were about 70 seismological stations run by Jesuits, in such a way that the historian of science said he called seismology the Jesuit sciences. And this is precisely, there was a very important Jesuit scientist, Father McElwain, in St. Louis University, and he became, he established what it was called then an American seismological network of Jesuit seismological network. It was called Jesuit American seismological network, with about 20 stations in North America. So this was very important in the development of seismology, and also in other parts of geophysics, like the study of the magnetic field of the Earth. We have the work of Father Stephen Perry, who worked at an observatory in the Stonyhurst College in England, and that he was a very pioneer in establishing the relation between the magnetic field of the Earth and the solar developments of the solar work. So the relation between what is called today external field of the Earth, which is the relation between the magnetic field of the Earth and the magnetic influence by the sun. So these are two aspects of earth science that I can now remember with contribution by Jesuits.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father. So may Professor Lam
Yes.
ask you?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wong. And Lucia, please switch on my video. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is also to Father UDÍAS. Yeah, with the similar approach. Yeah, we know that some Jesuit scientists they link up their study of scientific research with theology, or their link up with their faith in Christianity and Catholicism. For example, Tahiti Sadan, his famous book, The Phenomenon of Man, is very influential to the Vatican II Council. Yeah. Further, can you, is it quite often that the Jesuit scientists, would like to link up or apply their scientific findings on their evangelization work or on their faith expression? Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit more on this aspect? Yeah.
Well, I would say that the first thing is that Jesuit scientists keep separate very well what was their scientific work and was their religious mentality. So when they were doing science, they were just doing science. So this is very important. And some of them try to bridge and give, for example, the best known is French Jesuit Chicheng, who developed a Christian approach with elements of the vision of the evolutive world. But this is a different thing. When he was doing science, he was just doing science, and his work in geology and paleontology was strictly scientific. And this was kept by all Jesuits working in for example, one of the latest directors of the Vatican Observatory made very clear that the Vatican Observatory was doing just scientific work.
Yeah. Thank you, Father. Thank you. Yeah, very clear. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. In the chat room, there's a question for Dr. Ma. It says, still a question about the distinction between science and religion. And for the Jesuit missionaries in late Ming and early Qing, there was not such a distinction, neither in Europe nor China. And they promoted heavenly studies. Is it legitimate to project the modern concept of science?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Thierry Minot. This is a very good question. So in this paper, actually, I was not trying to distinguish the purely Jesuit priests from the Jesuit scientists. As you said, actually, at that time, many Jesuit missionaries themselves were also some scholars or scientists. So in this paper, what I try to distinguish is who contributed to Chinese science. In other words, whether or not these Jesuits introduced European translation or instrument to China. In other words, even if this Jesuits was a scientist or scholar, but unfortunately, according to their biography, they did not introduce any scientific works to China. So I just simply called them as the Jesuit priests in China. So this does not mean that they were not scientists or scholars. And another question is, yes, so I try to avoid to, compare the modern science or the modern concept of science to the science at that period. Here, I just to, abstract the main story from this conceptual issue. So I mainly distinguish who contributed to Chinese science and who did not. Okay, so we just call them science rather than modern or not. This is a big issue, and it's beyond the scope of my knowledge, actually. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because we are going to run out of time. Maybe let me post a question which was posted in the Q&A box, and now I posted in the chat room. This is a question from Mr. Lei for Father UDÍAS. He says, there were so many Jesuit scientists, doctors, and scholars in the last few centuries, very obviously. However, no matter what the reasons behind, apparently, in his understanding, we have fewer priests working in the secular academic world. Though I personally know some Jesuits who were doctors, and some of them, they are teaching in the secular universities. Of course, Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI both have tendency to call the priests to focus more on their profession of God. How would the current phenomenon have any impact on the evangelization or mission in this contemporary world? Wow.
Yes, this is a very interesting question, and I think one can really put the question in this way: how is it that religious congregation dedicated so much effort to science from the very beginning? And one has to look at what happened in the very beginning. I have written a book in which this is explained very carefully. It's published by Springer, Verlag, Jesuit contribution to science. There in the first chapter, I try to explain why this thing developed, which is really something that doesn't happen with any other religious congregation. And that happened because the Jesuit order was created precisely when modern science started. It coincides the publication of Copernicus' book with the founding by St. Ignatius of the society. And when they dedicated most of the efforts of the Jesuits just in St. Ignatius' time to education, creating schools, colleges, and universities, they made as an important part of their teaching mathematics and astronomy. And this was a novelty at that time. In the 16th century, mathematics was just the secondary part that was taught in philosophy. But Jesuits made of mathematics an important subject of their colleges and universities. And this was a novelty. And that's the reason why so many of the creators of the modern science, for example, Descartes, were pupils of Jesuit schools. And that was continued also in the modern times. So I think this is very important to consider. First, that the Jesuit order is created when modern science started, that they became aware that this was a very important part that in the teaching of universities and colleges, and they continued all through their history with the present in science. I don't know if I really explain what you were asking.
Thank you. So perhaps before we close this section, let us take a look at the from Cynthia Pond, right? This is sharing, right? She says, thank you for the 3 very interesting presentations that debunk the stereotype of antipathy between religion and science, and it is a tribute to Jesus' sometimes unorthodox evangelizing approach. For example, trace Christian elements in Chinese classics and Confucianism, use astronomy to attract Chinese emperors and scholars, learn medical knowledge from shamans in the Americas, biology, maybe virology in South Asia. The lessons for us today: if not science, what is needed today by the people with whom we wish to share the gospel? Yeah, a very thought-provoking question. Thank you very much. And let me thank the 3 speakers again, Father UDÍAS, Professor Han, and Professor Ma. Yeah, thank you very much. And so let me pass the stage to Anselm or Lucia.
Thank you, Dr. Wang.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Dr.
you very
Wang,
much.
Dr. Ma, Father UDÍAS, and Professor Ansi. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, our moderator and speakers. We will have a 10 minutes break before our next section. We will have a timer on the screen for you. See you later.
Thank you. See you then.
Thank you.
Thank you.